Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
The roast chicken was dry, the wine too sweet, and the conversation, like always, teetered on that strange edge between casual and condescending. My brother, David, had this particular gift, really. He could turn the most harmless subject into an opportunity to broadcast his superiority, like a peacock in a Patagonia vest. Somewhere between a forkful of mashed potatoes and my father's second rant about how kids today can't even read a clock, David leaned back in his chair, swirled his glass, and dropped the kind of line that starts wars and changes family dynamics forever. Tech isn't for everyone, he said, smirking, the words soaked in passive aggression and wrapped in just enough of a laugh to make it sound like a joke. But it wasn't a joke, and everyone at that table knew exactly who it was aimed at. He didn't have to say my name. He never did. It was always in the way he looked at me, like I was the family house cat trying to run with wolves. Before I could even lift my head, Grandma Ruth, bless her, turned slightly in her chair, fixed her gaze on me, and with that trademark mix of sweetness and brutal honesty that only a sharp 83-year-old can get away with, asked, "Is that why your name was on the acquisition announcement last week?" You could have heard a pin drop. No one breathed. Not even Ben. Forks paused midair, chewing slowed, and my dad blinked 3 times like he couldn't decide if he'd just misheard his mother or if she'd finally lost it. I didn't say anything. Not right away. I took a sip of water instead, let the moment hang there in the air like smoke, thick and creeping into every corner of the room. David's smirk melted off his face like butter left out in July. He blinked slowly, leaned forward just a hair, and said, with just the right mix of arrogance and disbelief, "Wait, what are you talking about?" He looked at Grandma, not me. Because looking at me would have meant acknowledging something he wasn't ready to even consider. That maybe, just maybe, I'd done something he didn't know about. Something big. Grandma didn't flinch. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin, the way she always did, and said evenly, "There was an article in the business section. Said Rachel Adams, co-founder of Sentined, confirmed acquisition terms confidential, but sources estimate mid-8-figure range. That wouldn't be you, would it?" David laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was that nervous, choking on your own ego laugh that men like him use when they're caught off guard. "Must be another Rachel Adams," he muttered. "There's like 1,000 of you." That's when I finally looked up. I didn't raise my voice, didn't throw my napkin, didn't slam the table or recite a list of achievements like some award show montage. I just met his eyes and said, "There's only one with the back-end key." And for the first time in, I don't know, maybe 20 years, David didn't have anything to say. You see, the thing about being the quiet one in the family is that no one expects you to be dangerous. They think being soft-spoken means being slow or unambitious or scared. But there's a special kind of power in being underestimated for decades. You start to enjoy it. You learn to use it. And by the time they figure out you're playing a whole different game, you're already at the finish line, sipping something cold and watching them try to catch up. But let me back up for a second, because the story doesn't start at that dinner table, even if that's where the first domino fell. It started years ago, in the margins of my life, between grading papers, parenting alone, and trying to pay for car repairs with freelance tutoring gigs. David was already a rising star by then. Startup founder, podcast darling, TEDx speaker with hair gelled just right and sound bites like "hustle harder, sleep later" printed on mugs. He'd made it in everyone's eyes. Me? I was the compassionate one. The kind one. The one who always brought the mashed potatoes to dinner and never had anything serious to talk about. I used to think it was just family dynamics, you know? Some people are born to shine, and some people hold the mirror. But I learned the hard way that sometimes people keep you small on purpose. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Because if you ever stood up, if you ever built something of your own, they'd have to confront the fact that they weren't special. Just louder. So no, I didn't start a company to prove anything to David. I didn't even plan it, not at first. It started as a side project, a way to help students manage anxiety with a chatbot I built after hours using free tools and forums full of engineers who never asked if I had a degree in computer science. They just answered my questions. And slowly, piece by piece, I started building something real. Something human. But all that? That's later. For now, we're still at the dinner table. I excused myself to the kitchen because I could feel the heat rising in my chest, and I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of watching me gloat or, worse, cry. Ben followed me. He didn't say anything at first. Just leaned against the counter, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning my face like he was trying to measure the moment. Then, quietly, he said, "You gonna tell them the rest?" And that's the thing. I wasn't sure. Because while Grandma had dropped the first bomb, the truth was no one in that room knew just how deep it went. Not David, not my father, not even my mother, who'd always said, "You're a people person, Rachel, not a tech person." They didn't know who had really tested the earliest versions of my AI. They didn't know about the fake consulting name I'd used to hide my identity when applying for grants. And they sure as hell didn't know that the very app David had publicly mocked 2 years ago, the one he called a glorified therapist toy for teachers, was now integrated into half a dozen school districts across the country. They thought they were dealing with the same Rachel Adams who used to ask for help setting up her router. They didn't realize I'd built the damn infrastructure they were standing on. But maybe it was time they found out. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't finished yet. It's strange how, in hindsight, the most monumental shifts in your life never come with fireworks or neon signs pointing toward destiny. Instead, they creep in like whispers at the edge of a noisy room, barely noticeable at first. Until one day you look around and realize the whole damn house has changed shape while you weren't looking. The truth is, I didn't wake up one morning and decide to take on the tech world. I didn't march into a venture capitalist's office, pitch a revolutionary idea, and walk out with a check. That's David's story, or at least the story he tells to make himself feel important. Mine started in the quiet, during long nights filled with half-drunk coffee, the hum of an aging laptop, and the soft sound of my son breathing in the next room because I couldn't afford to keep the heat running full blast during winter. After the divorce, which wasn't messy but still left behind that peculiar kind of silence that only comes when two people stop believing in each other and no longer bother to pretend, I found myself navigating single motherhood with little more than a teacher's salary and a whole lot of internalized guilt that I wasn't giving Ben the life he deserved. I was teaching English literature to high school juniors, which meant I spent most of my days trying to convince 16-year-olds that reading Steinbeck was worth their time, and my evenings grading essays that blended TikTok lingo with half-baked thesis statements about loneliness and the American dream. It wasn't glamorous, and it sure as hell wasn't impressive enough for family bragging rights at Thanksgiving, but I loved it in a quiet, stubborn way. I liked helping kids see the world with a bit more curiosity, even if they rolled their eyes at me 90% of the time. But what started to wear me down wasn't the job itself, it was the way it felt like no one outside the classroom took any of it seriously. Every time David visited from the Bay Area, it was the same routine. He'd ask condescending questions about how the school system was still stuck in the 20th century, offer unsolicited advice about educational technology he'd never once used in real life, and then, without fail, throw in some comment like, "If you ever want to build something real, let me know. I could introduce you to people." As if raising a kid, shaping young minds, and surviving on a public servant's paycheck weren't already real enough. Still, I wasn't bitter, at least, not then. I just swallowed it, the way women in families like mine often do, smiled politely, and got back to the business of keeping my world intact. But something shifted during the pandemic, when everything moved online and I was forced to reimagine the way I taught overnight. Zoom classrooms turned students into blurry thumbnails, and emotional meltdowns became more frequent than homework submissions. I started to notice patterns. Certain students were thriving in the new environment, while others were slipping away completely, unable to cope with the lack of human connection. That's when the idea first crept in. Not fully formed, not with a product in mind, but just a question. What if there were a tool that could pick up on emotional cues, subtle changes in tone, choice of words, even typing rhythm, and alert teachers before a student fell too far behind? I didn't know how to build something like that. I didn't have a degree in computer science, and I'd never written a single line of code that didn't come from a YouTube tutorial or a desperate midnight Stack Overflow scroll. But I had curiosity, a stubborn kind, the kind that doesn't care if it's not supposed to belong in a certain room. I started small, building out a rough prototype using free no-code platforms, dragging and dropping logic trees, testing responses, reading case studies, and experimenting with open-source sentiment analysis tools that most people didn't even know existed. I called it Sentient, mostly as a joke, because the name sounded too serious for what I was doing. At the time, it was just a bot that could have semi-natural conversations and assign an emotional wellness score to students based on their replies. I shared it with a few teacher friends, not expecting much. But then something strange happened. They loved it. They used it. They shared it with other teachers. And then school counselors started reaching out, asking if they could try it too. Meanwhile, back at home, my father was still convinced I had no real ambition, even though I was managing lesson plans, grading, freelance editing gigs to make extra money, and now this little AI side project that kept me up until 2 in the morning. He once said, without a trace of irony, if you were more like your brother, you wouldn't be so tired all the time. And that right there, those words, they were the beginning of the end of my patience. Because David wasn't tired, sure, but that's because David never had to clean puke off a rug at 2 a.m. while trying to write lesson feedback or negotiate a cheaper car insurance policy because his startup salary didn't cover his half of mom's meds. He didn't raise anyone, carry anyone, or build anything without someone else holding open the door. And then there was Christmas, 2 years ago, the year David gave me that smug little book called The Tech Dummy's Guide to AI. He wrapped it in shiny gold paper and placed it in my lap like a prize. Everyone laughed. Even Grandma chuckled, although I saw the flicker of something in her eyes, pity, maybe, or guilt. I thanked him, smiled, and quietly placed the book in my purse without flipping a single page. What no one knew was that just a few weeks earlier, Sentient had hit 1,000 active users, and a small startup accelerator, one that David's podcast had once dismissed as small potatoes, had invited me to pitch. But I didn't tell anyone. Not then. I was still building. Still watching. Still deciding if the world was ready to take me seriously, or if I was going to have to make them listen the hard way. That was the beginning. The soft, quiet, completely unspectacular beginning of a storm none of them saw coming. And I liked it that way. The decision to stay anonymous wasn't born out of fear, or even modesty, but from something far more calculating. A quiet need to protect what I was building from the corrosive doubt and backhanded compliments I knew would flood in the moment my name was publicly attached to anything remotely successful. I'd spent the better part of my adult life being measured by everyone around me against their narrow definitions of intelligence, value, and contribution. And no matter how many students I helped graduate or how many lives I positively influenced inside those beige classroom walls, the only things that seemed to count in their eyes were app downloads, revenue models, and the number of followers one could attract by saying the most obvious thing in the most confident tone. So I made the conscious choice to operate under a name that meant nothing to anyone, an alias that allowed me to work without the expectation to explain, justify, or endure patronizing feedback from people who wouldn't know a neural network from a sewing machine. I partnered with someone I trusted completely, Dina Torres, a former student of mine who, at 17, had shown more raw talent and drive than most adults I knew at twice her age. She had gone on to study computer science at a mid-tier university, never one to chase Ivy League dreams just for the prestige, and instead focused on building and tinkering and, most importantly, listening. When I reached out to her, she didn't blink. She didn't laugh. She didn't say, "Isn't this a little outside your lane, Ms. Adams?" She simply said, "Send me what you've got," and within a week, she had taken my rudimentary prototype and helped me turn it into something leaner, smarter, and scalable. We worked in the margins of our lives, after her contract gigs, after my grading marathons, on weekends, late nights, long calls filled with more brainstorming than small talk. We registered the LLC under the name Sentient Solutions, choosing a registered agent service to keep our real identities off public record. For the business filings, we listed my alias, Rachel Avery, a combination of my name and my late mother's maiden name, and for months, Not a single soul in my personal life knew a damn thing. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt powerful, not because I had anything to prove, but because I had created something no one could take credit for, criticize to my face, or try to shape into something more palatable or convenient for their egos. The platform grew quickly, almost too quickly at times. Word of mouth among educators spread faster than we could handle. We were offering something most tech companies didn't understand, an AI product not built to impress investors, but to solve a real, emotional problem. It didn't just measure engagement or spit out analytics, it listened, in a way most systems didn't, because I had trained it to respond the way a good teacher does, with nuance, with patience, and with the kind of empathy that can't be faked or coded by someone who's never worked with real people in a crisis. Meanwhile, David was making headlines for a spectacular flop, his latest venture, an AI-enabled productivity assistant he'd branded as Life Pilot, had crashed and burned on launch. Mostly because it was based on the faulty assumption that everyone wanted to be optimized like a machine. He hadn't thought about what people actually needed. He'd just built what sounded good in a pitch deck. I watched him spin the failure into a lesson on resilience in one of his podcast episodes, talking about how tech entrepreneurs must embrace failure like a badge of honor, and I couldn't help but laugh, not cruelly, but in that bitter, quiet way you do when someone keeps stumbling through the same locked door because they're too proud to admit they don't have the right key. He still had no idea about me. None of them did. And that ignorance was my shield. I'd sit at family dinners, nod along while David went on about his latest mentorship panel or some half-baked blockchain idea, all while Sentient Ed quietly surpassed 10,000 users and entered beta programs in 2 different school districts. The irony was almost too rich. My brother, who had spent his life telling me that the future belonged to those who coded, was being lapped by a former literature teacher and one of her former students, all because we understood something he never could. That technology, at its best, isn't about domination or disruption or all those other Silicon Valley buzzwords. It's about connection. It's about recognizing that human behavior can't be boxed into categories or datasets, and that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is simply listen. We kept reinvesting the little revenue we made. We didn't take salaries. We poured it into development, compliance, security, and eventually a partnership with a low-profile but highly respected nonprofit that provided tech tools to underfunded schools. They didn't care who we were, they just cared that it worked. And it did. Teachers began reporting lower incidents of student burnout. One school counselor emailed us to say the tool had flagged a student who later admitted to contemplating self-harm. That email made me cry in the middle of a CVS parking lot, because it meant that what we were doing wasn't just functional, it mattered. Of course, not everything went smoothly. There were bugs, regulatory hurdles, one potential investor who, during a virtual pitch call, asked if Rachel Avery was available to do media appearances because people respond better to founders with a softer, maternal image. I ended the call. Politely. But Dina and I both knew that once they figured out who I really was, the questions would get uglier and the praise would get thinner. The decision to keep my identity hidden during our early growth wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. Because I knew how this story would be interpreted if I let them control the narrative. I would become the mom-turned-tech founder, a novelty, a human interest story buried beneath headlines about real players doing real business. I'd be used for headlines, passed around in media cycles, and then discarded the moment my existence no longer served someone else's idea of inspiration. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not again. We grew into a team of 5 for full-time, 1 contractor, and by the time the acquisition interest started rolling in, we were already in talks to pilot a version of Sentient Ed in an entire statewide system. But when the email came, the one that changed everything, it wasn't because of a press release, or a demo booth, or some strategic PR stunt. It came because someone in the acquisitions team had a child in a school using our system. That child had opened up about their anxiety for the first time in 2 years. That parent wanted to know who had built this thing. That parent had the means to do something about it. The email read simply, "We'd like to talk. Confidentially. Are you open to acquisition?" It was from one of the biggest tech conglomerates in the country, The kind that David name-dropped to impress people on panels, the kind whose logos get printed on startup slides to make VCs pay attention. And still, I didn't tell anyone in the family. Not a word. Not a whisper. Because I knew what was coming. I knew that silence was no longer just survival, it was set up. The next time they tried to define me, I'd already be out of reach. And when the truth came out, it wouldn't be because I asked for recognition. It would be because they had no choice but to see me. But the moment I remember most clearly didn't come from that email, or any of the contracts or metrics or legal jargon. It came one night when I found Ben sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing his college applications, and he looked up at me and said, "I used Sentient Ed last semester, you know." I knew it was you. I could tell by the way it listened. That was the first time I realized I'd done something irreversible. Something undeniable. And for once, I didn't have to explain it to anyone. There's a certain quietness in betrayal when it comes not from enemies or rivals or strangers in high places, but from the people whose voices you once instinctively trusted, the ones who knew your laugh, your coffee order, and the exact way you always folded your napkin after meals. It doesn't roar like thunder or break down the door with force, it seeps in, soft and slow, through familiar hands, disguised as concern or curiosity, until you realize that what you thought was a shared history has become a tool, and what you kept close out of love has become ammunition in someone else's arsenal. For me, that moment didn't come during a public scandal or a hostile meeting in some boardroom. It happened in my own living room, with the low hum of the dishwasher in the background and the faint sound of a basketball game on the TV my father refused to turn off even during family visits, because apparently, background noise helped him relax. It was 3 days after the first acquisition email had landed in my inbox, 3 days during which I had done exactly what I always do when faced with something massive and life-altering. I compartmentalized. I kept grading papers, made dinner for Ben, answered emails under my alias, and paced the kitchen floor while pretending I was just mulling over lesson plans when in reality I was reading term sheets and trying not to pass out. I hadn't told Ben about the acquisition offer yet, not because I didn't trust him, but because part of me couldn't believe it was real, and another part needed to hold on to the power of the secret a little longer. Like savoring the last sip of wine before someone notices your glass is still full and asks for a toast. It was on the 4th evening, as I was getting ready to review the second offer, which included a staggering valuation, stock options, and a quiet clause that allowed me to stay on under a new title while still maintaining anonymity, that my father, Mark, decided to root around in the storage cabinet in Ben's room. He said later that he had been looking for the spare router because his hotel Wi-Fi was spotty, but I knew the truth. He never did learn how to respect boundaries, not when it came to what he thought was his family's business. He found a printed folder labeled Sentient Ed Pilot Notes, which Ben had been using for his computer science capstone project. It wasn't sensitive, just mock-ups, testing feedback, and notes on emotional calibration, but it was enough to light a match. That same evening, David called Ben and invited him out for coffee, which was suspicious enough in itself since David never reached out to Ben unless he needed help setting up a LinkedIn campaign or wanted someone to debug his website footer. According to Ben, the conversation started casual, but quickly swerved into probing questions. Where did he get the idea for his capstone? Who helped him with the research? What consultants had he been working with? And whether he'd ever thought about taking the project to the next level, a phrase David always used when he wanted to take credit for something without asking for permission first. Ben, bless him, didn't flinch. He told me later that he let David talk, let him build a whole fantasy in which Ben was some sort of prodigy who had magically created an AI platform while casually acing his college midterms and playing basketball on the weekends. Ben just sipped his coffee, smiled when appropriate, and made a mental list of every detail David tried to fish out. He didn't confirm anything. He didn't deny anything either. He just kept nodding, like a spy on his first mission, which I suppose, in a way, he was. When he came home and told me what had happened, I felt that strange, sinking sensation in my chest that wasn't quite fear, but something sharper, something that felt like disappointment fused with rage. My father had violated our privacy, not out of malice, but out of a condescending kind of entitlement, the same kind that had colored every interaction between us since I was old enough to argue back. And David, well, David did what David always does when he catches the scent of potential. He tried to wrap it in his name and parade it around like a prize he'd earned. I knew what would happen next. I knew David would start digging, start calling his connections, start asking questions in the worst kind of way, not directly, not honestly, but through the insinuations and passive prodding that men like him have perfected. He would try to make it seem like he was offering help, when really he was looking for leverage. And I couldn't let that happen. So I moved fast. The next morning, I called Dina and told her it was time. We scheduled the final meeting with the acquiring company's legal team. We finalized the confidentiality agreement, signed the documents that transferred intellectual property rights, and arranged for the wire to be held in escrow until the closing week. I still didn't attach my real name to the public side of the deal. But privately, within the sealed documents, my signature sat clearly, unmistakably, in bold print, right next to the line that read majority founder and lead architect. The deal came with an option for me to remain on board as Chief Strategy Officer under the same pseudonym if I chose. They offered me a quiet office, a private line, and the freedom to continue shaping the product without having to answer to the noise of public scrutiny or industry gossip. It was everything I wanted. And yet, when I walked out of the small, windowless legal office where the final signatures were collected, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt alert, like someone who knows the story isn't over just because the paperwork is done. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the check, the physical manifestation of everything they said I couldn't do, and I thought about all the moments I had let pass in silence. The dinners where I'd bitten my tongue. The birthdays where David gave me self-help books wrapped in irony. The passive emails from my father, forwarding articles on career pivots for women over 40. The way Grandma sometimes looked at me with this quiet sorrow, like she knew I was hiding more than I let on but also knew I had to. That's when my phone rang. It was Grandma Ruth. Just her voice, soft and steady. "Are you ready for Sunday dinner?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Because suddenly, it wasn't just a question about logistics, it was the signal, the moment I had been waiting for, the subtle invitation to step into the light, to let the truth finally unspool across the table where it all began. And I knew, as I looked down at the finalized acquisition agreement and then up at the empty kitchen, that the next dinner wouldn't be like the ones before. This time, they'd see me. All of me. But whether they'd understand what they were looking at, that was still up for debate. Sunday dinners in our family had always followed a strange, unspoken script, one that seemed carved into tradition with the same rigidity as the family recipes Grandma Ruth kept taped to the inside of her pantry door. Recipes written in her delicate cursive that somehow survived countless arguments, pregnancies, divorces, and relocations across state lines, as if familiarity itself could be served in casserole form. The gathering was supposed to be predictable, uneventful, even David bragging about something recent, but ultimately unimpressive, my father recounting some outdated financial wisdom like the gospel, my mother hovering between passive listening and quiet judgment, and me, often invisible at the far end of the table, offering polite reactions and refilling water glasses like a guest rather than someone who once lived and breathed among them. But that night, the one where Grandma opened her mouth and changed the entire temperature of the room with a single sentence, that night was anything but predictable, and the silence that followed her question landed like a thud against every wall in the house. David's eyes twitched, just slightly, his jaw stiffening in the way it always did when he was scrambling to process information he hadn't been the first to discover. I could see the reflex playing out across his face, the desperate mental calculation of whether this was a joke, a mistake, or a cruel coincidence designed to humiliate him. He looked at me as though he expected me to confirm it was all a misunderstanding, perhaps even laugh along and relieve him from the growing tension that clung to every crevice of the table like thick dust. But I didn't give him that relief. I reached, slowly, into my purse and retrieved my phone, not to show him something petty or theatrical, but simply to pull up the article in question, the one Grandma had referenced with terrifying precision. The one that featured a photo of me standing beside a nondescript office building in jeans and a cardigan, my hair pulled back, smiling with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from finishing a journey no one knew had started. I slid the phone across the table toward David, who looked down with a forced scoff and muttered something unintelligible, probably an attempt to downplay it all, to suggest that maybe I had contributed in some minor, irrelevant way, or that perhaps the publication had made an error and confused me with someone else. But the proof was there, in my face, my name, and the caption that read Rachel Adams, co-founder of Sentient, following last week's acquisition by Helix Technologies Incorporated. My father shifted in his seat, coughing lightly like his throat had suddenly dried, while my mother reached for her wine glass and stared at me with a mixture of confusion and something unspoken, perhaps regret, perhaps admiration, perhaps resentment for not having seen any of this coming. David finally broke the silence with a tone so forced it could have been a script from one of his podcast monologues. Look, that's unexpected, but good for you, Rachel. I guess anyone can get lucky once. And there it was, the last defense of a man who had always seen himself as the axis around which everyone else revolved, who now had to sit there and confront the inconvenient truth that the sibling he had treated as a footnote had quietly built something bigger than anything he'd ever touched. I looked at him, not with triumph or anger, but with the kind of cold clarity that comes from knowing your worth has finally stepped out from under someone else's shadow, and I said, not loudly but firmly, "It wasn't luck, David. It was the hours you spent mocking while I was building. It was the years you told me tech was for people like you while I was paying attention to what people actually needed. It was the silence you never noticed, because you were too busy talking." The table sat in stunned silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that followed a shocking announcement. It was the silence that comes from reckoning, from the slow realization that everything you thought was true about someone has been appended. And now the landscape of your memory has to be redrawn. Even Grandma Ruth, who had clearly known more than she let on, simply nodded once and went back to slicing her chicken, as if her work here was done and now the rest of us just needed to catch up. What none of them knew, not even Ben, was just how deep the roots of this revelation ran. Because the story didn't end with the acquisition or the article or even the uncomfortable dinner conversation. The deeper truth, the one that lingered like smoke beneath the surface, was that I had allowed them all, consciously and meticulously, to test Sentient Ed themselves during the pandemic, when I had offered a beta version to family members as a virtual therapy assistant for educators and parents, disguising its real purpose and collecting anonymized behavioral data that would later prove invaluable to the emotional modeling framework we patented. They had no idea that their responses, their hesitations, their passive-aggressive complaints about useless software had all been processed, coded, and fed into the very system that would later define the backbone of our product. So when Grandma, with her usual surgical precision, leaned over her plate and said to me, "You didn't tell them about that part, did you?" I felt a slow, spreading warmth of vindication settle over me, not because I had tricked them, but because I had finally turned their doubt into fuel, and their voices, once so quick to dismiss, had become part of the foundation they could no longer see or reach. Ben raised his glass slightly in my direction, not a toast, not a spectacle, but a silent acknowledgement between two people who understood the full arc of the story, who had watched it grow in silence and now watched it land like a thunderclap without ever needing to shout. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to shrink myself, to make anyone comfortable, or to soften the edges of what I had done just to preserve the family dynamic. I let the silence linger. I let them sit with the knowledge that while they were busy measuring me against their tired metrics, I had built something too nuanced, too human, too quietly revolutionary for them to comprehend. As I gathered my things to leave, my appetite long gone, the moment fully delivered, I walked past David, who still sat motionless with his eyes on his untouched plate, and I said quietly, "Tech might not be for everyone, but understanding people? That's something you never figured out." And with that, I left the room, not with a bang, not with applause, but with the certainty that the final page of the story had been written in ink they could never erase. They still don't know the whole truth, not really. They don't know how many times I almost gave up, How many nights I spent crying in silence while building code I didn't know would ever work. How many condescending smiles I endured just to get to the next version, the next test, the next school system that said yes. They don't know that everything they thought was weakness was actually the very thing that made Senshin Ed what it is. A system built not to dominate, but to understand. And maybe they never will. Because while I've said what needed to be said, I've learned that some victories aren't loud. They're lived in the quiet power of walking away with nothing left to prove and everything still ahead.